afternoon. Let's try that again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Much better. I am so happy to be here to welcome you to Scott Park Campus, University of Toledo, and to the city of Toledo. As you know, we're here for an announcement. We're also here to pause and to think about how we can deal with a very serious and terrible epidemic that is affecting not just the city of Toledo or Lucas County, but across this country. And that is the question and the issue of heroin addiction and how we as a community, not just a local community or a state community, but a national community can address this particular issue. It's important that you are here, not just these dignitaries that are going to come and say welcome, but that you are here because you are people on the front line, whether it's law enforcement or social agencies, mental health agencies, reentry folks I see, or social workers, criminologists. We are all here to deal with a very serious problem, but also to take an opportunity to see what are the opportunities that we can have. As many of you know, that while drug addiction was seen as just an urban problem, we now know that it is not just an urban problem, but it is a problem that affects us all, not only personally, but economically, our neighborhoods, our cities, our country. And so now we're here to take an opportunity to learn about it, as well as to have some chances for ways in which we can deal with it. So on behalf of the citizens of the city of Toledo, I welcome you to this opportunity for learning, for opportunity for discussion, and hopefully, and most importantly, an opportunity of hope. Because for those of you who are on the front lines, many times you think, well, front lines, many times you know or think that it is hopeless. But I believe that we all are here because we do believe that there are opportunities for growth, development, and hope. So welcome, and at this point, we'll turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm Ava Dustin. I'm with the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Toledo Branch Office, and welcome. On behalf of U.S. Attorney Stephen Delavac, thank you to ONDCP Director Botticelli and Attorney General DeWine for your efforts here in Toledo today, and more broadly, your continued leadership on this issue. And thank you to CBS, whose decision to make Narcan more widely available is exactly the type of change and partnership that is required in the battle against opioid epidemic that has taken a hold of Ohio and this country. 3 years ago, confronted with a staggering death toll, my boss, U.S. Attorney Steve Delavac, and our office tried to think creatively about what could be done to stem the tide of overdoses. Our bread and butter is prosecuting large-scale drug trafficking organizations, which we continue to do and do well. But we knew that this problem was so complex that any solution would have to be broader than just arrests and prosecutions. We reached out to hospitals and doctors, treatment professionals and people in recovery, and parents, and of course, our law enforcement partners like the DEA, FBI, local police, and Attorney General DeWine and his team. We came up with a community action plan, which is available on our website at justice.gov/NDOH. That plan is what we informally call the all of the above approach, combating the scourge of heroin, fentanyl, and prescription painkillers use will require law enforcement, but it can't just be law enforcement. It will require teachers, parents, and community education, but it can't just be about prevention. It will require more treatment, but it can't just be about treatment. It will require working with doctors to change prescribing practices, but it can't just be about prescribing practices. Rather, it has to be all of those things: enforcement, prevention, treatment, and working with the medical community. Today's events and CDS's decision to make Narcan more widely available are more examples of all of the above approach that will be necessary to turn the tide of death that has gripped our region and our nation, because just one more death is too many. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy Plouk, and I'm the director of the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. The state of Ohio has introduced and built on a lot of additional interventions in the last few years, and the primary expansion to more treatment for folks occurred when the governor and the General Assembly supported Medicaid expansion back in January of 2014. In the first year and a half of this availability of health care, more than 600,000 Ohioans connected and enrolled in Medicaid for health care supports, including mental health and addiction services. Of that number of individuals, 398,000 people received at least one mental health or addiction service provided by Medicaid. I think that's an excellent example of how need, that some of which was previously unmet, is now being met in the state of Ohio. With Medicaid available to more individuals, our local partners and state dollars can be used to leverage more recovery supports. In the last 2 years alone, the state of Ohio has worked with community partners to invest $12.5 million in recovery housing. This is safe and low-cost housing for individuals who are in early stages of recovery from addiction. And these resources will serve about 1,000 people at any given time. And so we see that as an excellent example of forward progress in this state. Additionally, we've launched partnerships with many of Ohio's jails. We have $3 million per year at this point invested in partnerships with our local ADAM boards and county jails around the state of Ohio. We have projects underway this year in 38 counties, and we will see that continue into the future. We've also introduced a new partnership with the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections to introduce more treatment professionals into Ohio's prisons, so that individuals who are in need of treatment in that environment can hopefully connect with what they need and then transition back to Ohio's communities without the threat of relapse being as imminent for them. Additionally, we have additional community supports that will be available starting this calendar year for individuals who are leaving prison and would benefit from things like recovery housing. Finally, and I know that there was a lot of discussion about naloxone earlier today, our state has $1 million of general revenue funds invested this biennium, $500,000 a year, to make available more of the life-saving naloxone to first responders in each county in this state. And so these are just some examples of some of the work underway. I want to recognize Lucas County for its leadership. We actually were here this summer launching our opiate toolkit that communities could consider as they're looking at different sorts of strategies to combat the opiate epidemic. And I think Lucas County offers an excellent example of different kinds of collaboration between criminal justice, healthcare, behavioral health services and supports. And so I'm very pleased to be here today, and I appreciate the fact that Director Botticelli and the Attorney General have selected Toledo as a location for today's events. So I hope you find the discussion this afternoon to be productive, and I look forward to listening myself. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's an honor to be standing up here today. My name is Tiffany Brackett, and I am a person in long-term recovery from substance abuse. On December 23rd of last year, I celebrated 6 years sober. I loved every drug ever put in front of me, but the one that caused my downfall were opiates, specifically pain pills and black tar heroin. Never did I dream in a million years I would be sticking myself with a needle every day to get high. Never did I dream in a million years I would lose everything, including respect for myself. While other individuals my age were building their lives, going to school to get great educations, I was sitting on my bedroom floor scraping black tar off of aluminum foil. I will not stand up here and glorify my drug use. It was a dark time in my life, and parts of it still haunt me today. I found something online that describes addiction perfectly. Addiction is shooting up in the nearest gas station bathroom because you simply can't wait any longer. It forces you to call your dealer at 12:03 a.m. because your money just came through, and you'll be darned if you wait another more reasonable hour. It's crawling around on the floor desperately, hoping to find a random pill or a speck of drug you dropped. It's not just because you can't wait to get high, it's mainly because you can't spend another second rocking back and forth, staring at the clock wondering how only 5 minutes have passed. Addiction is impatient, unforgiving, and manipulative. Don't test it. If you go in thinking you'll stay in control, you will lose, and you will never be the same again. Author unknown. Instead of standing up here focusing on my addiction, I want to focus my talk on recovery. When I was 22 years old, I checked into rehab. I remember begging my brother Chris to drive me and not leave until I was behind locked and closed doors. By then, I had been shooting dope for 2 years, and I was using pills for 6 years prior to that. I knew nothing about medicated assisted treatment, but the doctor decided to put me on buprenorphine, or Suboxone as most people know it. Medicated assisted treatment saved my life. Majority of my sobriety has been spent on Suboxone, but part of it was spent on Vivitrol. Both have helped my recovery tremendously. They have allowed me and given me time to get my life together without the worry of cravings and relapse. The greatest thing about my recovery journey so far has been the amazing support system I have. I have a great husband, Devin, my smart son, Xavier, my amazing parents, Chris and Diana, and my wonderful doctor, Dr. Michelle. The major thing in any recovery is having hope. Without hope, you have nothing. And you have to learn to build your spirituality also. What you choose is up to you. I'm telling you, though, that recovery is possible. I remember when I went to rehab, so many people talked about my addiction and how bad it was. I remember feeling alone and isolated because of all the hurt I had caused so many people. Now today, as I stand here, I would have never imagined a country where heroin and prescription drug abuse is so rampant. I tell people in recovery from drugs all the time that they need to be open to any pathway a person takes, regardless of what it is. Society has placed such a stigma on addiction, and addicts tend to place the stigma on medicated assisted treatment. But when do we stop all the stigma and learn to just accept the way a person wants to live and stop being judgmental? We need to stop treating this as a moral failing and start treating this as a disease that it is. Recovery means a new beginning. It means a second chance at life. In my recovery, I've built a life I would have never imagined. I have an amazing family, a great job working at Zeph Recovery Housing, and most of all, I have my self-respect back. I'm working on my education. I have purpose and meaning again. I am no longer that person reaching for my cell phone to call my dealer to score dope. Nothing is more fulfilling than waking up every day and enjoying the sun on your face, the wind in your hair, and knowing that you won't be sick without your fix. As Socrates wrote, the secret to change is focusing all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. It's an honor to have the Director of the National Drug Control Policy for the White House in Toledo today. I would like to introduce Director Botticelli.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's really a pleasure to be back in Ohio. I want to thank Tiffany for sharing her story on recovery. As also a long-term person in recovery, I can tell you it's never an easy feat to stand in front of an audience and bare your soul. And I want to really thank her for using her story and her journey to inspire all of us to know that in the depths of this epidemic there is hope and that there is recovery. And that everybody deserves a second chance in this life, sometimes third and sometimes fourth chances. And I think her story and her willingness to share her story is really emblematic of why we're all here today. And I want to also welcome everyone who helped us to be here today. I want to give special thanks to Mayor Hicks Hudson for welcoming us to this city. I'd also like to thank Attorney General Michael Wine for helping lead and organize today's event, and more importantly, for being a leader on substance use issues, not only here in Ohio, but nationally. We also want to recognize the U.S. Attorney's Office, who you just heard from, who continues to be strong partners in this. And to Tracy Plug, who's the director of the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, all her work and leadership as well. For many years, I was Tracy's counterpart in the state of Massachusetts, so having a very strong state director who knows about this issue and can help focus resources on the state level, I know is tremendously important. I'm really glad to be here today for a very important panel discussion on the effects of opioids on our communities. And not only the tragedy that is reached, but what we can do to end this epidemic and prevent the future use of heroin and prescription drugs and the misuse of pain medications, and help people access the treatment they need and deserve for recovery. We really have some terrific panelists today. In addition to Attorney General DeWine, we have Krista Lammers, who's a family advocate. We have Sheriff John Tharp, he's the guy with the uniform in case you couldn't tell, who's been an extraordinary partner in terms of the work that they're doing. And Dr. Madi Jumat, who is an addiction specialist for a long time and medical director at the SEP Center, which I'll get a chance to sit down later on today. You know, as we've hosted these community forums, we've had an incredible amount of dialogue about what we can do to make our communities healthier and safer. And it's no secret that prescription drug misuse and heroin use have been devastating, not only Ohio, but the rest of this nation, and we're feeling both the public health and public safety impact of this devastating epidemic. And this is truly a national issue, and addressing the opioid epidemic remains a top priority for this administration. In 2011, the administration released a prescription drug abuse prevention plan, which established 4 pillars: education, monitoring, drug disposal, and working with law enforcement to address the prescription opioid epidemic. And today we're going to talk about solutions. But here's what we already know. We also know that treatment is the key to recovery, and that medication-assisted treatment is underutilized in many places, but for many people it's a necessary component to get people to long-term recovery. We know that education and expanding education for prescribers and patients, strengthening state-administered prescription drug monitoring programs, providing safe disposal of unused, unwanted, or expired medications, reducing diversion and shutting down pill mills, and ensuring access to the opiate antidote naloxone are essential elements of a workable strategy. Solving this problem takes collaboration between federal, state, and local officials to find out what works for each area. I was pleased earlier to join with the Attorney General and representatives from CVS Health today to announce their plan to expand access to naloxone throughout Ohio, and to present the Washington Township Police Department with a drug disposal unit so people can properly dispose of their old or expired prescription drugs. This is a huge step forward for Ohio, and initiatives like these are exactly what we need to end this epidemic. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist and today's co-host. Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine is one of Ohio's leaders working to end the opioid epidemic. He helped craft an agreement to provide a rebate for each dose of naloxone, which is a critical resource for first responders and community members, and has spread awareness about this life-saving treatment. During his tenure, he made the opioid epidemic one of his top priorities, creating a special heroin unit in 2013 aimed at providing outreach, legal, and law enforcement assistance to communities across Ohio. In 2014, he created the Heroin Recognition and Investigation Training Program to help law enforcement officers respond to the issue, and this past year, he launched an overdose prevention task force to better track overdoses caused by opioids and prevent further overdose deaths. Ohio is truly lucky to have an Attorney General so committed to ending this epidemic. So please join me in welcoming Attorney General.
Director, thank you for coming back to Ohio, and thank you all for being here. Just a couple maybe comments of some of the things that I have seen in the last few years. I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room the nature of this problem. We're losing 3, 4, 5 people every single day in Ohio who die of overdose of heroin or prescription drugs. I was asked by the news media a few minutes ago, why is that? And I don't think any of us really know the answer, but I'll have 2 things that I will at least observe. One is the Mexican families, the cartels, the business people, whatever you want to call them, now grow the poppies in Mexico. They process it there. The heroin, of course, comes up illegally through our southern border. And they have what really is a perfect business model. They sell it cheap, $10, $15, $20, but they also know the product they sell is horribly addictive. And they also know that once someone is addictive, is an addict, that the amount of heroin that it's going to take to keep them going every day is going to go up and up and up. And so what starts as a $15 a day habit may end up at a $1,500 a day habit, up to potentially 100 times that it takes. So it's a great business model that has coincided with a time in our history, and I'm not a sociologist and can't really explain it, but the stigma that is attached to heroin does not seem to quite be what it was. When I was a county prosecuting attorney in the 1970s, late 1970s, heroin was something that even most people who did drugs and did a lot of crazy stuff, heroin was where they drew the line, and they would not do that. Today, heroin is in every single county in the state. Is likely, or more likely, frankly, to be in our suburbs, in our rural counties, than it is to be in our cities. It cuts across every economic group, all racial groups, gender. It does not discriminate. It is everywhere. And so everyone's family certainly is a potential target. I found a couple things that I think are good trends, and things that show that we are, in fact, fighting back. First of all, the communities where I've found that they've really started to make a difference have been communities where they've gotten so sick of seeing their kids die and their family members die and their friends die, they literally rise up in a grassroots effort. And for that grassroots effort, to focus on education and prevention, and to focus on treatment, for that really to work, it has to really involve all segments of the community. It has to involve, yes, it certainly has to involve the medical community. Yes, it has to involve educators. But it also has to include business and professionals. It also has to include the clergy, our churches, our faith-based groups. And those communities that have done that have started to turn this thing around. Not overnight, but have started to make a difference. When I observed this a few years ago, that's why I set up a special unit in our office. Yes, we have our heroin unit. Yes, we do our law enforcement assistance to local police and sheriffs. But I think what is new, dramatically new, is that we have people in our office who spend their time focusing on how to help other communities do what the few communities that have really started to fight back are doing. And so if anyone needs help in organizing in your village, your community, your town, whatever, we have people who will come out and not tell you what to do, but really help you understand what has worked in other communities and just share that information. The other thing that I think is a very positive trend, and it's certainly Lucas County with the sheriff really should take a great deal of credit for this. A year or so ago, the sheriff called me up and he said, I have an idea. And frankly, I thought I was going to hear another law enforcement idea of enforcement, which is fine. He said, I have a plan to try to help people get into treatment, keep them into treatment, and then when they're done treatment, help them to get back into the community and to make it. And I said, what was it? He told me what it was. And he said, we do need some help. And I said, look, I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I think it makes a lot of sense to do it. We've been at this for about a year, Sheriff, and you've gotten help from the county, you've gotten help from other individuals. We've helped you some, and the results so far look very, very good. So we're seeing law enforcement look at this from a holistic point of view. Because law enforcement, besides EMS and emergency rooms, no one sees this problem more than law enforcement. And law enforcement with their sheriffs, prosecutors, police departments across the state are beginning to come to the understanding that they need to look at this thing holistically and not just from the point of view of who we arrest and who we put in jail. And so, Sheriff, you're a real leader in that. And actually, last week we had 1,000 people we put together from all over the state who came to a church in Columbus, and the sheriff was really one of the stars. And we wanted to highlight him and highlight his program and highlight the program that's going on right here in Lucas County. And so, Sheriff, there were people who left that day, I think, who were inspired and who are going to be trying to put something like that together. So I will stop and we'll be on to our panel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you to the Attorney General. And I know it's going to sound loud in here, but all of us in our microphones are going to speak loudly because we're webcasting this. And I've been told that we have to be loud to make sure that we hear on the webcast. So please don't think that we're shouting. But, you know, the Attorney General talked about the importance of every sector of our community coming together, and we've assembled a panel of just a few of those folks who have been doing work to talk about not only what they see, but how they've implemented solutions. And so I'll segue from the Attorney General and introduce Sheriff John Tharp, who is the sheriff for Lucas County, who the Attorney General talked about his response, and I know that we have some of the officers from the DART unit here. I want to thank them for the work that they're doing on this. So we just heard from the Attorney General how law enforcement has a huge role to play, not only in keeping our community safe, but also how you stepped up in terms of looking at assisting people in the community. So I'd wonder if you talk for a few minutes about your experience with this and how you came to the conclusion of helping people get into treatment. So I'd spend a few minutes talking.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. I do have to say, looking around the rooms here, we have some of the most brilliant minds in the country, and probably every one of you could be sitting up here as one of the panelists. But when we first started the DART unit, Drug Abuse Response Team, and I wanted to acknowledge our folks that are in the Drug Abuse Response Team. Thank you for the great job you do. You're amazing people, and I do appreciate you. But when we first started the unit, it started out by us receiving so much information from the community that overdoses were occurring. And then going into the correction facility at night and seeing people coming in that were going through detox. But all the overdoses were occurring, and we did not know about this. We did not know that, we weren't hearing about the overdoses. So we met with the fire chiefs, and the fire chiefs is telling us that they're doing a lot of runs to homes for overdoses. And that what was happening is that people, when their children are overdosing, has overdosed, a 17-year-old daughter that overdosed, most people do not want to call a complete stranger on 911 and say, my daughter just shot up with heroin. They would say, my daughter cannot breathe. So rescue would get there and they would take them to the emergency room, and it was never reported to us that this was actually an overdose. So the fire chiefs committed that they would let our dispatchers know that there would be a call coming to them that this is an overdose. So then we would respond. We would do what we needed to do to be able to respond and help addicts. We were fortunate enough, we had some professionals in the room, like Matt Russo and Scott Silak, that had helped us out and taught our officers what to do, how to do it, what buttons to push, what buttons not to push when going to the hospitals and working with folks that had overdosed. So we started out with 2 officers, but the volume, it got so great that we had to add additional officers. So we added another 3, that was 5. Soon it became 9, and now we're up to 15 officers that are in this unit. A few of the officers are part-time that are in the unit, but the unit needs to continue to grow because of the numbers of folks that we're getting calls about. But just one story, I always like to tell this story, a little humorous, but one of the officers, DART officers, shared with me that he had been working with a person for right around 170 days that they had had the individual clean, totally clean from any heroin. But the person was an addict for 8 years. And so we know that relapse is part of recovery. We've learned this. We're not the experts in law enforcement, but we've learned this. So this person relapsed, and when he shot up heroin, he called the DART officer and told him what had happened. He said, will you come out, get me, help me? And so the officer did. He responded, he helped. But but the person that overdosed, he said, you know, in all the 8 years that I'd ever been shooting heroin, I never thought I'd shoot up, turn around, and call the cops on myself. But it's working, and we appreciate you. But this is the most amazing group of folks that are in this unit. So when we first put the unit together, and then I'll stop because I could talk all day long, but when we first put the unit together, folks were saying, do we want them to have degrees in counseling? Do we want them to have degrees in social work? What do we want their degrees in? But what I wanted was really the passion to do the job, the knowing that they're going to be working with folks day in and day out. They could be at a family function, they could be at a picnic, they're going to get a call, they're going to have to step aside, they're going to have to apologize to their wives and their families and go help the person that called them. So I appreciate you folks, and you are amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheriff, to you and your unit for the extraordinary work. We're really pleased today to also be joined by Krista Lammers, who is a family advocate, and I think like so many families around this country, who has kind of turned their grief into advocacy and action, and we're really thrilled that she could be here today to tell us a little bit about her story.
And I really wish that I had taken speech class in high school right now. My 37-year-old brother, Jeff Shirey, took his own life on February 19th of 2014. He walked out of Flower Hospital after detoxing for a couple of days and walked onto the expressway. He then crossed a lane of traffic and ran into the path of an oncoming semi. Jeff was a heroin addict. We knew about his heroin use for about 16 months prior to his death. He had been a recreational drug user for much of his life, but that all changed with a car accident about 9 years ago that left him with a back injury. His story is like so many others. He was prescribed Percocet and OxyContin, which he used and abused, quickly leading to addiction. He was a functional addict for about 5 years, continuing to work at his job as a journeyman plumber and pipe fitter. When doctors realized he was addicted to the meds, they cut him off, forcing him to the streets for his pills. When he could no longer afford the cost of the pills needed to support his habit, someone suggested that he try heroin because it was so much cheaper. And that's when Jeff began the downward spiral that would cost him everything he had ever worked for. He lost his wife and kids, he lost his home, he traded his truck for $1,000 worth of dope. He stopped working and was eventually forced to move back home with my mom. The day Jeff died, my mom was supposed to pick him up from the hospital to take him to rehab. They had spoken earlier that morning, and he made sure she was going to take him. He begged her one last time to let him come home, and she told him there was no home to come home to, that he had to go to rehab. When she went to pick him up, she was waiting in his room watching the commotion on the expressway and had no idea it was Jeff down there. Jeff was a husband, a dad to 4 kids, son, brother, grandson, uncle, nephew, and a friend. He enjoyed fishing, working in his water garden, riding motorcycles, dirt bikes, and 4-wheelers with his kids. He took care of my 95-year-old grandmother until he entered Flower Hospital 2 days prior to his death. He had a great sense of humor, and he still makes me laugh to this day, often through my tears, in spite of his absence. Not a day goes by that he doesn't cross my mind, but I would rather have him gone than to watch him continue to fight that fight every day. It's a very helpless feeling to watch someone you love struggle with heroin addiction. I can't begin to fathom what it's like to be the one struggling, especially when the idea of throwing yourself in front of a semi is less terrifying than the prospect of trying to beat your addiction.
And to my far left is Dr. Madi Dumet, who is a medical director for the Zeph Center, and he's been practicing medicine for more than 30 years and has been focusing on addiction medicine for over 16 years. So he has a tremendous amount of experience. He's been an advocate for medication-assisted treatment, for workforce training, for recovery housing, and support services in long-term recovery. So we're thrilled that you could join us today and love to hear a few minutes about your perspective on this issue.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's attendance today, especially the panel. After 15, 16 years of experience, I could look back and say that in the past 2 or 3 years, we really got a long way in dealing with addiction. We had a an integrated treatment protocol here at the ZEF Center, where we start doing not only the medication treatment and let the patient go on their own. We start using all aspects of treatment, including the medication-assisted treatment, the psychiatric evaluation and support, the recovery housing, plan to get the patient back to society and work. And we work with local and local psychiatric services and authority services with the sheriff, mainly in many projects here in town, like the DART program. That, looking backward to like 15 years ago when I started doing some work with the dependency, we had so limited resources and not a clear plan of what we could do. This became more clear lately about how we could really do a better job, how we could take that person from being fully addicted and have lost his family or friends or kids to being a clean, sober, and put them back in the community and get them a job to work. And that's how I look at it as a success, by measuring not only the days of sobriety, by measuring the whole outcome of the treatment by being successful, not being sober only, but back to the society in a respected way and functional way. And
I want to hear from you too. So I'm going to start with the Attorney General, who talked about the importance of this holistic, comprehensive response, that it's not just a law enforcement response or a public health response, but that we work together. And I wonder if you could share your experience in this in terms of just talking a little bit more about the importance of every sector working together, but particularly how we work hand in hand with law enforcement and public health around that response.
You know, I think in this state, and I imagine nationwide, Mr. Director, when law enforcement first started really seeing this problem, there was a lack of understanding, I think, among the general public. And at least in Ohio, the lack of understanding, particularly in people who were in rural areas and people who were in the suburbs. And so I think part of what our challenge has been is to get people's attention. And quite candidly, I think the news media certainly in the last year, gets it. And they're really covering, Sheriff, you and I have talked about this, but they're really covering this as the tragedy that it really truly is. And there's realization. I mean, if we had, 4 or 5 people who died in Ohio for some other disease that was going through here that no one ever heard of, we would be all up in arms and be doing something. So I think the first thing was to try to get people's attention. As I said, I think the news media has done a great job in that, and we've talked a lot about it. But I first started seeing communities come together, not over the heroin so much as over the pain meds. 4 or 5 years ago, for example, in southern Ohio, I would see a few of the communities, Portsmouth, Ohio, for example, and they still have a problem. I'm not saying they've gotten rid of their problem, but what you saw is just a grassroots group of people who just said, we're sick of seeing our kids die. We're sick of seeing our family members die. We maybe don't know what to do. We're going to do something. And then people starting to get together. We've seen other communities where, Marysville, Ohio, for example, where the local Honda dealer put up money for a education program. I think what we see is a beginning to come together of communities. Law enforcement, sheriff is used to working with law enforcement. The treatment folks are used to working with treatment folks. And the educators, they think everybody dumps down on them because they have to do everything, and we ask the schools to do everything. And so what you find in communities is sometimes people weren't talking to each other. And I think the most important thing that many times, Director, you and I were talking about this before, you've held a lot of town hall meetings, I've had a lot of town hall meetings, and what's always interesting is we'll get somebody who stands up in one side of that forward.
Good, thank you. Krista, thank you for sharing your story, and unfortunately it's one of many, many stories that all of us have heard for a very long time. But you've changed and you've turned that grief into advocacy. So as you think about your reflection as a parent and as you talk to others, what more can we do, or what advice would you have to other family members or parents who are dealing with this in their family?
Even before you're dealing with it in your family, talk to your kids. Tell your kids never to touch it. That my daughters were 7 and 5 when my brother died, and they heard the dialogue between my mom and I, and between my husband and I, just about the daily things that were going on with Jeff. And I think they've got a pretty good handle on how bad heroin is and the destruction that it causes in your family. And then when you are dealing with it, talk about it. Jeff died almost 2 years ago, and when we were going through it, we didn't know who to talk to. When he went to rehab, when we tried to get him into rehab, it didn't seem like there were very many resources out there. So when he died, we felt like we needed to do something. So about a year ago, we started our own support group. It's called Heroin Hurts, Hope Heals, and it's for the family members that are still dealing with family members with addiction. That was our first start, but it's a small group. There's not a whole lot of people coming to it because they don't know about it. Again, it's because people aren't talking with each other about it. And then they raise their hands and say, oh, we have that, just like you were saying. So just talk to people about it. Don't keep silent. There's still a lot of shame around addiction. And I don't think we were ever really ashamed with Jeff's addiction was, it was a disease. It was definitely a disease. We weren't ashamed of him. I didn't feel that there was a stigma involved, but there's still so many people that have that stigma surrounding addiction, and that's the saddest thing. We need to get rid of the stigma, the shame, and the silence. I've been preaching that for 3 years now, maybe going on 4. But biggest thing, tell your kids, don't ever touch heroin.
You know, one of the things was when Tiffany was talking about stigma, I saw you shaking your head. Do you have thoughts for those of us on the panel or those of us on the federal government? Are there things you think that we can do to help really diminish, help at the local level diminish some of the stigma around issues around substance use?
I was talking to Sheriff Thorpe about this when we were waiting to come in. We went to a town hall meeting in Waterville back in November, and there was a member of law enforcement that was in the audience who was still saying that she was under the impression that heroin addiction was a choice. And I think the biggest thing is to educate members of the medical community, law enforcement, anybody that ever comes in contact with addicts, that maybe at the beginning there was a choice that was made, but at some point it's not a choice anymore. They lose control. There's no choice anymore. It's gone.
Great. Thank you. Doctor, you've been doing work in this field for a long time, and one of the things that we talked about, and Tiffany's story was an example of medication-assisted treatment. So we now have 3 very highly effective medications that I think are broadly considered to be underutilized in many facets. And wonder if you have thoughts about how I know you do it at the center, but how might we think about increasing access to medications and maybe even changing the perceptions of people as it relates to medications and addiction?
Yeah, before I go to that point, I would like to mention one simple point to help understanding a couple things about the addiction problem, mainly the opiate we're talking about. Yes, definitely most patients start as a prescription, like your brother, and the doctor intention, I don't believe, was bad at that point, but the outcome was bad. And what's important in the whole treatment here is how could we educate the doctors mainly about what to do in similar situation, and how to understand the seriousness of prescribing opiate for a lengthy duration and high dosage, which will create addiction no matter what, because of the tolerance, as we know. The bad doctors who prescribing it so they could get more money out of it, essentially for bad purpose, bad intention, we'll leave it to the law office, like the state or local office, and they will find them. They will eventually take care of them. But the good intention with bad outcome only comes by educating people and by essentially providing the resources available at the state level or national level, like the ORS program, for example. I think it is way underutilized. The treatment, medication-assisted treatment medication, for some reason, people fear of prescribing it or underutilizing it. To my understanding, like treating, for example, hypertension, maybe you find about 80% of the patient receiving some sort of treatment, maybe not perfect, but receiving treatment. Patient with emphysema or COPD, probably even higher number because they complain about breathing problem. The patient with drug dependency, seems like the number of treated patients nationwide, not only local in our area or Ohio, state of Ohio, range anywhere between 10 and 15%. And that's very low. So, essentially educating patients, educating doctors, doing maybe more programs like this program will open eyes that there is things available for treatment. Sorry, I shifted a little bit gear here, but I'll go back to your question about the medication-assisted treatment program. Yes, there is many actually, more than 2 or 3 medication available. The commonly used medication in the past few years is the buprenorphine or Suboxone trade name. This medication is really helpful and helps save lives, help patient maintaining sobriety. It could be used for acute detox, essentially to make the detox process less severe and pretty much more milder course, and it could be helpful for maintenance. Yeah, definitely the goal is to, down the road, to get all the patients who were addicted on opiate in general, heroin or pain pills or whatever it is, to be drug-free and restored back to the community and work and family. But some of them, maybe the alternative is keeping them at least for a lengthy period of time on maintenance until they stable enough, and then try to rock the boat, not early in the course. Saying that, we have quite few number of patients in our program on Suboxone, and they're doing really well. Moving on to different medication. Available is the old-time methadone, and we have that in our program too. Methadone is still used. The difference between, they both opiate based. The difference between methadone and Suboxone, methadone is an opiate agonist, so there is a problem of risk or higher risk of adverse effect. So I would rather still use Suboxone myself over the methadone, except when the patient is not really reliable yet early in the course to be given the medication to go home and do whatever they want to do. Moving on to the naltrexone. Naltrexone is a good drug. And this is like I direct my message to the community doctor here. I'm pretty sure there's quite a few here in the audience. Naltrexone does not require any specific licensing. It does not require any specific degree or so other than being a doctor of medicine to prescribe it. And it does work at least better than not doing anything about the topic. The other message would be, if you have an issue, refer the patient to the local treatment plans. I think in Toledo we have quite a few, maybe a handful at least, of treatment programs. We happen to be one of them, probably the best.
We can say that here, right?
Yeah. So at least, I mean, taking the initiative or the first step to refer patient to program is very important. I mean, your brother doctor, instead of stopping their medication and let them seek heroin from the street, they could have stepped in initially and say, hey, listen, be direct with the patient, tell them you have a problem with addiction, tell them that now the medication is not given for the right reason, you know, for your problem, and we need to work on it. But instead of saying, well, you are addicted, I'm stopping your medication, help that guy or that patient, he or she, find a right treatment in the area. That would have probably saved somebody's life as much as probably Narcan would have. Narcan is a very great drug, since we're mentioning medication now. Narcan is a great drug in saving lives. Sheriff and I were talking about it a couple times before, and I think one of the audience in the Narcan conference before coming here asked how quick we should give the Narcan. The answer, as quick as we diagnose the overdose. Narcan is safe medication. If we highly suspecting overdose on opiate, don't wait until the patient have cardiac arrest or stop breathing. With the first sign of going down or going under, go ahead and give the Narcan. And usually the kit is providing 2 dosing. So the first dose, even if it wasted, we gave it a chance to bring that person back to life. So we really did not waste big thing here. And at least we gave the patient suffering from overdose a chance to come back until we have the help from EMS and 911 and what have you. And that's pretty much, and there's more medication we could talk about, mainly about alcohol and the other stuff, but I don't think this is the main topic at this point.
Good. Thank you. Sheriff, I want to ask you a question. While we've seen some success in certain areas, one of the more disturbing trends we've seen, not just in Ohio, but in certain parts of the country, has been a dramatic increase in fentanyl, both fentanyl seizures and fentanyl-related overdose deaths here in Ohio and other parts. And I wonder if you could just speak to what you've seen in terms of impact in Lucas County and what you've heard around fentanyl.
Well, we have seen more heroin laced with fentanyl, but the Lucas County coroner, Dr. Forney, just shared with us is that within the last 5, 6, 7 weeks is that there's been 20 people die of just straight fentanyl. So they're using straight fentanyl, not being laced with heroin. So this is what we're seeing, but we're seeing more and more people that are actually lacing the fentanyl into the heroin.
It's one of the issues, and again, we talked about collaborative efforts. It's why, in some respects, law enforcement has to be part of the equation in here in terms of getting some of the fentanyl and heroin out of our communities, because we know that that's really driving the both heroin availability and fentanyl availability are really driving some of the overdose rates that we have here. As I do these community forums, I like to give everybody an opportunity to give a suggestion or two for what more we can do on the federal level. Are there things, there are clearly lots of things that are happening here at the local level, things at the state level, but also want to provide an opportunity before we take some questions from the audience, if you had a recommendation or a couple of recommendations for things that we could do at the federal level. Clearly we know resources are always an issue. I think that's a given in terms of what we're doing.
That's what I was going to say, give us some more money for the garden.
I know, and that's it. So we'll assume, no, but again, and I think that part of what we've tried to do, and the president's tried to do, is make sure that we have additional resources to do that. But if there are other things that you think that we should be doing, give us some suggestions.
Yeah, actually, I always been thinking of one major, in my opinion, major contributor to the problem. For example, Suboxone or buprenorphine licensing start up as 30 patient a year, 30 patient at a time in the first year, and then the maximum is 100. I know there's a lot of agencies working on increasing the number. my question here, why can't anything be done that every year of experience, you will be allowed to have like 25 more patients? Do it as increment, essentially, or maybe every like 5 year of experience. Well, 5 years is too long. Maybe every like 3 years of experience, you could add 100 more to the panel. I think that will really help a lot because, for example, 2-3 times a year, I have to shut down the service for new patients because I don't want to violate the law. So I'll say, well, I'm sorry, I cannot take new one.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Yeah, Doctor, for everybody who may not understand that, can you explain what the problem is? Because we hear this all the time, and it truly is a federal problem for Congress and the administration.
Well, as part of the licensing, to use Suboxone or buprenorphine or even like Subutex or similar product, the doctor have to have a special training. After the special training, their DEA give them initial waiver to prescribe that medication. In the first year of practicing, they allowed to have only 30 patients at any certain time in the active treatment. So essentially mainly to stop diversion and abuse of the medication, which is understood, sometimes there's doctor who really after the quick money or what have you. Well, after first year, the doctor have to resubmit waiver so we could get up to maximum of 100 patients treated with the medication at the same time. And that's the ceiling. We get the 100 and we have to stop. So if we divide the 100 on the month, even working days, 20 days, that means I could see 5 patients a day, that's it. So if I have any more patients, I have to send them to somebody else, or I cannot accept them in my program, otherwise I'll be violating the law and my license will be revoked or stopped. So.
Thank you for saying this, and this wasn't I didn't prompt him to say that, but actually the Secretary of Health and Human Services announced this summer that she is looking into proposing regulations about how we might increase the cap past 100 in ways that provide quality treatment and minimize diversion. So we hope that that proposed rule is going to be out soon, but we do think it's one part of our response. Attorney General, I want to give you a shot in terms of, are there things that we could be doing at the federal level? How can we help your leadership here in Ohio? Are there things that you've heard from as you've convened these meetings that we can be doing?
Well, I think it is a holistic approach, and we all have to work on it. We have an obligation at the state level, local level, the federal level. What the doctor just said, I hear that all the time in town hall meetings. I think it's also important for all of us who are in public office to, whatever level we're at, is to, talk about this issue. I mean, just focus on talking about it. Maybe we could have one day in the campaign where every candidate talks about heroin all day. Mm-hmm. I mean, seriously, because people are looking and they're looking for solutions. But it's important to use, as Theodore Roosevelt said, the bully pulpit of the presidency. Well, how about the bully pulpit of those who run for office, too? They got a pretty good bully pulpit. So.
That's good. Thank you. Krista?
Well, I'm pretty sure that it's been declared a local epidemic. Have they talked about declaring it a national epidemic?
Mm-hmm.
They have, but they haven't yet.
As an epidemic, we talk about this as an epidemic all the time.
But it hasn't technically been declared
I
a
think
national epidemic.
Public health emergency, is that what you're talking about?
Well, are we there yet?
No, I think we are, and I think we're at a place where, we see a significant amount of urgency and attention to this issue,
So if we're not talking about monies, that would be what we need in our community, and I bet it's the same community all over the United States, is detox beds and recovery beds. So if there could be conversation. I didn't know that. She told me, so I just repeated what. So it's detox bed and recovery bed. So might as well go ahead and get it out here. If we had every hospital in our community that would donate X amount of beds for detox and recovery, also for the private agencies of detox and recovery organizations to help us out with so many beds. I realize some people could only donate X amount of beds, but some other larger corporations could donate more beds. So, but that's what we need. So I'm getting this from our DART officers. They go out and they pick up someone and trying to help them and take them. They're driving around with them for 2, 3, 4 hours trying to figure out where they're going to take them. Well, they take them home, I guess, but they couldn't do that. So therefore, we do need more detox beds. So more conversation of that at the federal level would be huge.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. This is my second intake, because many times the sheriff program, the DART program, bring patient to us and we cannot take because we're already full. So because as another law violation issue here, we have to worry about.
So I just, for folks who have been doing this work for a long time, I just want to point out that we had a sheriff who just didn't ask for more officers to arrest and incarcerate people, right? So we had a sheriff who asked us for more inpatient detoxification beds. And again, I think it speaks to not just our focus on our public health focus, but how we continue to think about a different response from law. And I really want to thank you for doing that. I'm going to turn to some audience questions here, and this is one that I think we've heard a bit about, and I think it's an important question to ask because this is what people think sometimes, and it's important to respond. So the question is, how would you respond to people who say providing naloxone is enabling people with addiction to continue to use heroin? And just want to ask folks for their thoughts on that response.
Well, I would say anytime that we can save somebody's life, so we had 140 last year in our county, or in our territory, not in our county, in our territory. So. But if those family members would have had, or somebody was with that person, would have had it in hand, in their pocket, being able to use it right then, would we have had 140? So one life is certainly worth it. So I'm totally in favor of it.
Conference we had last week, we had 2 young ladies who had been saved. One was saved twice, literally brought back to life with naloxone, the other 3 times. And one of them stood up there and said, you know, when I hear people say that you're enabling us to do this, you know, what you're really saying is my life is worthless. You know, she's there, she's on the path to recovery. She's not relapsed for a long, long time, but she wouldn't have been alive if that naloxone had not have been available for the one young lady 3 different times. 3 different squads brought her back to death, back to life, and took her away from death.
Yeah, I would like actually to add one thing here, like most of the overdose is not happened because they know that somebody there could bring them back. Most of the overdose happened because they either underestimated what they're doing. For example, somebody who comes to treatment program, like our program, for example, and they clean and sober for like 3 to 5 days, and then for any other reason they decided to leave, and in their mind that they could still shoot like 1 gram of IV heroin because they did that for past 5 years. Well, now their tolerance is different, and they shoot it and they overdose. So many other examples I could give or reasons for overdosing. None of them, well, I could overdose because my friend couldn't bring me back. So I don't think that's a valid point.
Good. Thank you. Doc, I want to turn back to you. One of the questions that we got, which I think is really an excellent question, is how can we get people to access non-opioid pain management strategies? So as a physician, how do we promote and get a better work about not just prescription pain medication, but non-opioid pain management strategies? Do you see opportunities within the medical community for expansion of those kinds of therapies?
Well, in my opinion, this should be actually the first approach for most doctors to use a non-opiate related medication to manage pain, except for like a severe pain such as post-surgical pain and what have you. For general pain complaint in the medical office, no, I don't think any of the doctors should first jump, oh, well, let's give you some Percocet and maybe 120 of them will help you enough. You know, it should be essentially, let's start, for example, physical therapy, let's start some non-steroidal like anti-inflammatory medication, which is pain medication, including Tylenol and Motrin. That's what I take when I get pain. You know, and the educating doctors probably about the seriousness of easily prescribing opiate is very important, and that's what the state, I believe, now having program about that. The other thing is not to give up easily to patient request. I mean, patient, if they are drug addict and they're coming to the office because they have, well, they present as having pain, investigate it well, diagnose it well before jumping into a conclusion that, well, I'll just give them the medication and let them go. I don't have the time to, you know, to do further workup or what have you. So do the right diagnosis, do the right treatment, and then if pain medication needed, that's fine.
Great, good. One of the other questions and one of the other impact that we've seen with this epidemic has been the impact on our child welfare system. And the question that we have here, which I think is really important, says, any thought to the impact on children whose parents are addicted and the overwhelming burden placed on child welfare? We have timeframes for reunification to occur that often conflict with the timeframes needed for recovery, which I think is really interesting. And I'll talk a little bit about this, but then ask our panelists if they want to share any thoughts. I think it's really important that we have, we talked about getting the same people in the room together. And clearly, our child welfare folks working with our addiction folks, I think, need to work together to understand addiction treatment, understand reunification plans as it relates to someone's recovery plan, how they share information back and forth. And then the second piece, and we've been working on this on the federal level, is to expand family-based treatment. Parents who have an addiction, who have children, often feel like they have to make this forced choice between keeping their kids and going to treatment. But family-based treatment allows, particularly the mom and the family, to stay intact to do that. So it's one of the things that we're working on at the federal level in terms of increasing family-based treatment services so that mom and the kids can get treatment together in terms of the work that we're doing. But I just wanted to know if the panelists had any other thoughts about how do we work with our child welfare system? What are the opportunities that we have here to make sure that we are working together and not necessarily have different areas of focus? Folks have any ideas? Doctor, do you work with child welfare folks as part of the center?
I don't really work with the adolescent program in our at the ZEF Center. I work mainly at the adult program, so I don't really have much input on that part.
Mr. Director, I think it's what we've been talking about. It is communication. And the ideal would be family-based treatment. Mm-hmm. The people in the child welfare system are operating under imperatives imposed by the law. They're also operating under the imperative that's imposed by the fact that you have to look out for the child, and this child only has one time to grow up. So how those mesh together sometimes is very, very difficult.
Great. Yeah. Good.
It's not easy.
This I think is an important point that one of the people in the audience raised, that I hear reflected more and more, that I think is important to talk about openly. And it says that because of the demographic of people who are affected are more white, more middle class, and these are parents who are empowered, that knowing that racial disparity has been a contributor in many of our communities and how we've responded to addiction, how is the state and local government taking action to help communities of color who continue to be devastated by drug addiction? And I think that's a really important point here in terms of what we're doing. And I've talked about, and I've been doing this work for over 25 years, and we've had addiction and disproportionate impact of addiction in many of our communities, particularly our poorer communities and communities of color, for a long time. That has often, I think, been a challenge for us to get the attention. From my perspective at the federal level, I think part of what we have to do is use this opportunity that has been presented to us in terms of the attention that we have been getting around this issue, and make sure that we implement solutions that work for everybody, so that this is not just policy solutions that work for people in our suburbs or in our rural areas, but our historically impacted communities as well. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this has been an issue for many of our communities of color for a long time, and that it's important for us to use the opportunity that we've been given around the issues with this epidemic to move forward around policy solutions that work for everybody. So however we got to this place, it's important that we're here, and that we have to implement solutions that work for everyone, that we have to make sure that we have good culturally competent services and services located in those communities to make sure that we're dealing with the epidemic in a holistic way and focusing on many communities that have been impacted by this epidemic for a long time. So we have 5 minutes left, so I just want to give our panelists an opportunity to say any closing comments that they have, what they see are kind of the way forward here. What are our opportunities going forward?
One of the observations that I have personally made, I receive phone calls, as many of you do, all through the weekends and at night, and there are people that, for example, I received a phone call this weekend from a friend many years ago, and he told me that about what is happening with his son, but he asked me, he said, please don't say anything. He says, because my wife is embarrassed. I think we need to get over that being embarrassed. It is a disease. We need to do what we have to do to deal with the problem. I think there's some people that may be thinking, you know, my child, they're going to get through this. They got it. They can handle this. They can't handle it. And we're going to have to intervene, and we're going to have to quit being embarrassed. And in my opinion, what would be embarrassing is not to do anything. What would be embarrassing is not to address it, not to get help, not to call whoever it is that you know that you can get help. And that's what I'd like to share.
Thanks, Sheriff.
Thank you.
Krista?
I alluded to this earlier, but when we were going through Jeff's struggle with him, and there was no talk about the heroin epidemic. There was no information anywhere for us as far as we were concerned. And Jeff's death was very public. When he died, his face was plastered on the news, noon and 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. for a week. Jeff Garrett of the Toledo Blade wrote a couple of articles about him, and he's actually written several articles covering the addiction problem in Toledo, and I've always liked the way that he covers it and the spin that he puts on addicts. But it seems like ever since Jeff died, there's every day in the Blade and on the news almost every day there's talk about the addiction problem, and I just want them to keep talking. Don't let this get brushed under the rug and put aside. It was good to hear both sides of both the Republicans and the Democrats talk about it at their debates. I did watch both. So both sides are talking about it, which is good to me. So keep talking.
Great. I'm going to give the Attorney General the last word. So, Dr. Dumat? No, go ahead.
Okay, and my perspective to what's happening now and what's about the epidemic and what have you is very simple. For years, I thought I really don't have anybody to ask for help. So I go do my business and go back home, taking care of patients. And it was not really clear point to me for many years. Well, that's what's available, and I have to deal with it. In the past 2 years or so, 2 or 3 years, a lot of channel has opened, and one of the main channel, like you gentlemen being here. I really appreciate it, and that's very, very helpful to us in Toledo area to understand that it's not only us, it's not myself as individual or the other doctor who doing similar job, responsibilities only. It is everybody's. It's the power of the willing, essentially. And that's how we could get there, and that's how we could stop the whole thing. And we will there. We'll be there.
Great. Thank you. Attorney General?
You know, it's interesting you mentioned about talking. That actually is Governor Kasich's program. Start talking, keep talking about this. I mean, some of these things are somewhat simple or almost sound simplistic, but I think each one of us in our own families has an obligation to do what we can to focus attention on heroin and on the opiate problem. We are in for a long struggle. I mean, this is not going to end in 6 months. We're not going to declare victory. We may never have a total victory, but I think, you know, a very doable goal, and goals are to save lives. And Sheriff, what you're doing, you'll never know probably the total number of lives that program has saved. You know, maybe a teacher who focuses on and talks a lot about the problem of heroin and does a good job in the classroom may never know the lives that are saved. So it's not going to be instant, it's not going to be quick, but I think the one thing we know from experience is that everybody has to get involved. I mean, this is not going to be something that the president's going to solve. It's not going to be something the attorney general is going to solve or the governor's going to solve. I mean, we all have a role to play, but we all have to be involved in this, and we all have to talk to each other and push the different disciplines together to make sure that the disciplines are talking to each other. And I think meetings like this are certainly very, very helpful in doing that.
Great. I couldn't think of a more fitting ending. I want to thank the Attorney General for hosting us today, for our panelists for being here and their extraordinary work, and to all of you in the audience and people who are watching. I know that many of you have been on the front lines of this issue for many, many years. Just want to say keep up the good work. I think despite all of the tragedy that we see, I think you heard a tremendous sense of optimism that we have going forward, that by working together, by each of us playing our own role, that we can make a difference in this epidemic. So thank you very much for all of your work.